Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's go to Ottawa, and I tell you, I'm going to bring you into the most elite, progressive bunch of old guys that you ever will meet. These are folks who, talk about networks. These guys have known each other, looks like half their lives, if not longer. They work together in all of these wonderful organizations like the North-South Institute and the CCIC, which I think stands for Canadian Council for International Cooperation, and lots of family foundations that give money to worthy causes. They're really good guys. And the real reason for our conversation today is that they are longtime members of the Group of 78, which is an organization that I somehow stumbled into. I don't know how they let me in because I didn't know anything about them, but I kept going for years and years. And with COVID, I couldn't go lately, and they haven't, I don't know how much they've been doing anyway. But so I've missed going to Ottawa the last 2 or 3 years. And I get caught up with what they've been doing or what they're planning to do. And they're going to kind of enlighten me on how the whole thing got started. Because it started off as a very, very elite kind of a group of very smart people who had the right values. And they used to get together at a lake, Stony Lake, and then I don't know what all happened before my time, but anyway, we're going to find out, okay? Roy Culpepper is the current chair. He's an economist, and he worked at the World Bank. See, I told you, I'm letting you in on things. And Tim Brodhead is also, I'm not going to even give you all these qualifications because you were also at the you and Richard both were at the North-South Institute and other CCIC and stuff, right? Okay, good. There you go. And lots of foundations. I think Tim Brodhead is on every foundation of every charitable group in the world in the vicinity of Ottawa. So good for you. Richard Harmston was the chair of the Group of 78, I think, for several years when I was going. And he's also in the same nest of people. And Peter Meincke is a little bit different because I've known Peter since I think maybe 1971, because I came to the University of Toronto, Mississauga campus in 1971, and I believe he was already there. He was the Dean of Sciences, but since I was in the Social Sciences department, we didn't have much to say to each other except when he would give a little seminar on how to use the internet, or maybe even telling me how to use email for the first time. It was in those days. So anyway, Peter then went on to higher things, becoming the president of the University of PEI, and has been living more or less more sedate life in the vicinity of Ottawa the last few years. All of us belong to the Group of 78, and I'm counting on you to tell me what this thing is that I happen to belong to but don't know much about. Roy, you're the chair now, so give me a background, okay?
Okay, well, first of all, Meta, thank you so much for inviting us all to have this conversation. And it's being held now, or this year, because this year happens to be the 40th anniversary of the founding declaration by 78 people who urged the then Prime Minister Trudeau to move Canadian foreign policy in a much more progressive direction involving nuclear disarmament, a greater effort at international equity, and strengthening multilateral institutions in the UN in particular. So that was 40 years ago. And we figured that you shouldn't let an opportunity like a big anniversary pass without taking stock, see where you've come from, and talk about where you might be going in the years ahead. And, we've very recently, as I hope we can have an opportunity to discuss, launched some interesting new and different, for the Group of 78, different initiatives that mark, some bold new ventures. At least that's what we'd like to think.
Because if you came in 2012, did you say?
That's when I became a member, yes.
Yeah, and then you became president or chair or whatever in 2014, right? Okay, well, see, I think I date back even earlier. So welcome, young man. So anyway, well, let's go back to the founding dates. Who was in on the get-go?
Well, others, particularly Richard might chime in here, but people around Andy Bruin, who is a retired NDP MP, were particularly instrumental in bringing together this declaration. And a number of people like King Gordon were involved. And they had discussions and they went through several drafts. And eventually they came up with this declaration, which is a couple of pages long, and sent it to the Prime Minister. And interestingly enough, Prime Minister Trudeau actually responded in a way that suggested he had a hand in the response. So we were taken pretty seriously at that founding action by the League of 17.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What spurred this original declaration was, and in a parentheses here, there was no intention at the beginning to form another organization. It sort of grew out of the statement later on, which we can touch on in a very Canadian sort of way, but it was intended to be a one-off statement to the Prime Minister. And the backdrop is that this was 1981, and Reagan had just come into the White House in that year, and the Cold War was hotting up. Nuclear war was not an impossibility in the minds of many serious people. Domestically in Canada, Trudeau had come back into power in 1980 after the 9-month interregnum of the Joe Clark era, and he had turned his attention almost solely to domestic issues and the Constitution, which we all recall, of course, produced the Canadianization of the Constitution. But he had turned, because of that, he wasn't looking too much and providing much leadership on the areas that he had championed in the 1970s: international development, disarmament, multilateralism in general. And so, there were incidents of world politics in 1981 that spurred King Gordon, whom we can describe if you wish, to get quite angry with the state of play. And he got hold of Andy Bruin, as Tim said, former member of Parliament, and Murray Thompson, who had been engaged very much in the anti-nuclear movement historically, and said, we've got to do something. So they, as Roy said, produced a draft and went through many drafts. And they said, what do we do with this? Well, we should publish this. And we sent it to the Prime Minister. We should publish it. But we need to put some weight behind it, not just us three, but we need to find people who can support it. And so they went out canvassing. And they went to all sorts of different social sectors, labor, the faith community, academics, throughout civil society, of course, and
I think there were some celebrities.
Well, the arts community.
Pierre Bertrand and Margaret Atwood involved.
Margaret Atwood, Margaret Lawrence, that's right, and scientists, John Poliani, who's still with us, thank goodness. And
he just won an award, by the way. Did you know that?
That's right.
Yes. Award, which is good news. Go on. Sorry.
And parenthetically, a couple of our current members actually congratulated him on that award because they're still in contact with him. And so anyway, the statement was produced and it was fired off to the Prime Minister. It appeared in the press. A couple of press runs picked it up, and as Roy said, it in early January, we got a lengthy three-page response from the Prime Minister, who went into considerable detail in dealing with the points we raised. Mm-hmm. And the 3 points, by the way, the 3 major overriding points were that Canada's foreign policy should have as its basic priorities the removal of the threat of nuclear war, the strengthening of the United Nations and other global institutions, to deal with conflict and cooperation, of course, across the world, and the mobilization of resources for a more equitable world order, particularly for developing countries, the global south, as we now call it, and poor peoples around the world. Those are the 3 main thrusts, and they remained the 3 broad themes of the group when it eventually got formed. So that was the statement. Jump forward a couple of years, and Andy Bruin passed away. And in a way to salute him in his life's work, quite a number of people, including several people who had signed the original declaration, or the statement as we've described it, decided to get together at Stony Lake, which is, you recall, and that because Stony Lake was the site of the Bruin cottage. And so his family met there annually, and we all bunked into nearby hotels and guest houses and that, and met for a couple of days over a weekend to discuss world affairs, all in memory of Andy and his issues. And we did it again the next year. And out of that, somebody had the bright idea, why don't we create an organization? The typical evolution of Canadian organizations. And we sort of stumble into it, or back into it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that led to this, what do we call it? Oh, well, 78 people decided to, agreed to sign the original statement. Let's do so.
I had thought originally it might have been 1978, but
well, we've been called all sorts of things and misinterpreted all over the place, and that's part of the spark and fun of the name. And we tried to look at alternative names to give it a more apt description, something that's recognizable, and we failed every time and fallen back on our roots of the original 78. Anyway, that led to annual conferences, which we shifted to Ottawa up in the Gatineau at a retreat spot there for many, many years. And then eventually, within the last 14, 15 years, we brought those meetings into town so we could have more people attend.
I was wondering whether that was animated by the growth in the group. That Echo House, which was a lovely place, only held so many people. Was that the reason to move it into a hotel?
By and large, yes. And to have, although it wasn't for the membership expansion per se, although that certainly was a factor, but it was just to get more people were interested in attending the conference. And so by the time we brought it into town, we could move from having 50 or 60 people in residence for a long weekend to having 100, 150 people in a room discussing the same thing, and easier access all around. But that was many, many years later. So I'll Peter, you might want to chime in with anything that I've missed in the origins of the group.
No, that's a very comprehensive thing, but I would like to take this opportunity. You mentioned the good response that we had from the Prime Minister at that time, Trudeau. And I think that is one of the key things, because that continued. Even Joe Clark, for example, when we sent things to him in his various capacities, he always responded very well. And he even attended some of our meetings. Now we can't even get people from the public service to attend the meetings, which I think is really a sad situation in terms of the relationship between the government and the NGO community. At any rate, I just wanted to mention that there was a very tight and good relationship, and I think some of the things actually did have some effect, but it's harder and harder to influence the government these days, and we just don't seem to be getting that. And I'm talking not just of the group of 78, of a lot of groups.
That's true. That's true. I remember actually when you talk about Joe Clark attending, I remember sitting up until the wee hours of the morning.
That's right.
At an Echo, that Echo House out in the Gatineau. He came and he just, there were maybe a dozen or 15 of us sitting around and just chatting until way past midnight with Joe Clark.
That's
He
right.
wasn't any more the prime minister, but he certainly
Yeah.
it was a real thrill to have that conversation with him. And he showed up more recently, I think, when Peggy Mason got an award at something a couple of years ago, and he came to the reception or something. Good for him.
Well,
Yeah.
I think Meta. I think the other thing that you mentioned earlier, the range of people who signed that original statement. It's also a reflection of the time. 40 years ago,
Mhm.
there was enough interest in Canada's role in the world, and there was enough expectation that we would fulfill our commitments and our obligations, that you could reach out to people in the arts and in the academic community and NGOs and so on, and the churches, they all saw this as something that was relevant to what they were engaged in, and were prepared to put their name on a statement which broadly articulated the values that they held. It's hard to imagine that happening today, quite frankly. Maybe perhaps now around climate issues, but that's not strictly what the original statement was focusing on. Maybe that has an appeal and raises concerns across as wide a section of Canadian society. Perhaps even one might say the refugee issue is one which also is touching Canadians now across a lot of different sectors. But overall, Canada's role in the world, I don't think now you'd have an easy time interesting people for whom that is not a professional or specialized concern.
I agree with you, but I also think that Canada still is sort of coasting along on previous good reputation. That the global reputation hasn't tarnished as much as it ought to have, based on if it were just, And I wonder, it'd be interesting to speculate about why it is that Canadians are more timid about trying to take a leadership role in the world. I frankly find many Canadians much more parochial than I'd like to think, that our focus is so much on domestic issues that I don't know why people are afraid to step forward and say we want to change the world and we're in charge of doing so, There's
much greater awareness now about internal challenges we face in terms of how our society is failing large numbers of people, inequities that are built right into our economic and social system. Of course, the challenge of developing a different relationship with Indigenous people. There are lots of things that have come up which have forced Canadians to recognize that if we want to exercise a role of leadership in the world, we have to earn that. And part of earning it is putting to right a number of social, economic, cultural challenges in Canada that we have ignored for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think another factor is leadership. I think I wouldn't put it all on the citizenry, although I agree with what you said and what Tim has said. I think our attention's largely diverted to more immediate issues close at hand. But it's also a question of leadership. When Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau championed various causes in the 70s, there was a great rallying behind him. I think the citizenry felt good that he was reflecting their values internationally. And although at the civil society level, we would argue with many of the steps he would take that they were inadequate or, there were faults with him here and there, we'd fight over the minutiae. But the broad sweep of it was that he provided a degree of leadership on disarmament matters, international development, and other areas that I think Canadians were proud of and got behind him. And the polls showed that in terms of support for the causes that he espoused internationally. And same with the decade previously and the ongoing work on peacekeeping that was championed by Lester Pearson, which continued for many years. And of course, we've totally fallen by the wayside on that one as a country. So I think in the years, particularly the last couple of decades, maybe 3 decades, there's been a woeful lack of leadership at the top level in our country. And yes, there's domestic issues to deal with, as there is in every country, and ours are as complicated as most other countries, if not more so. But we haven't had the sense of commitment from the top offices in the country, either in the Prime Minister's office or in the foreign ministry, which has been undermined as an institution in the last many years, to actually say, all right, Canadians, let's rally around this particular issue, and here's what we're going to do about it, and are you with us? So I think it's those two factors combined: the citizenry being deflected in many ways, and the lack of political leadership at the top level.
Richard, even the Mulroney government, when you think of the leadership on South Africa,
absolutely, yeah,
Canadians were behind that.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, well, I agree with you that the leadership isn't there, but I also think that it has roots in the general awareness of the public, and that may simply have to do with the press. Because I watch television that, Al Jazeera or even CNN or something for news, because it is more inclusive. I subscribe to the San Francisco Chronicle because I don't see any Canadian newspaper with sufficient international coverage. But if I take the San Francisco Chronicle, about a quarter of the newspaper is full of little short articles, 2 or 3 paragraphs long about what's going on in Sudan or here or there. And you don't get that here as much here. So unless there's an actual demand for international news, or maybe it should be led by the press, that they should provide it and stimulate an interest in international news. But I think that there is a relationship, that the public is much more focused on domestic issues than international. So in fact, I guess that's one reason I kept going to the Group of 78 meetings, is at least I knew that we'd have a discussion of global affairs there, always, invariably.
I think I agree with Meta, because this just have to look at our elections. When the elections happen, there's very, very little content, or very little discussion about the foreign affairs. So I think that is what the message that is being sent to the politicians and the newspapers, is that there's really not very much interest in the public in foreign affairs.
Mm-hmm. Should we be doing something about it to try to give a little push? Sorry, Roy.
Yeah, I was just going to say that a real bellwether of how we regard Canada's role in the international arena is how international development is viewed. It was a very interesting line in the Globe talking about Harjit Sajjan going from defense to international development, shuffle in the cabinet shuffle. But the verb that was used was that he was demoted. He was demoted from defense to international development, which really puts things in the order in which they shouldn't be seen. And this has been happening for some time, because international development has increasingly been seen as a stepping stone for ministers on their way up through cabinet, or putting that into reverse on their way down to go through international development. I think the development portfolio is symptomatic of how we view ourselves in the world.
Plus the amount of money we give.
Exactly.
Is there any linkage between anybody in the group and anybody in a cabinet position, for example? Do you have any influence that I'm not aware of?
Roy?
Well, I would say if we have influence, it's more through social networks and people who are in officialdom rather than at the ministerial level. I think there are maybe 1 or 2 instances where people have links with ministers in cabinet positions, but they tend to be more exceptional.
Well, more crucially, perhaps now, considering the priority that's being given to climate issues, we have a Minister of Environment who has a whole lifetime of engagement with civil society organizations. So there certainly are strong links there for sure.
That is the new minister, right? And that's a good sign, right?
I think
As of, actually today, I think, is the first I knew about it.
Yeah.
Tell me about him. Is he, invite him. How about inviting him to the group of 78?
We just did. We sent a letter yesterday and doing just that.
Okay. And he knows you already.
He knows, he would know many people involved with the Group 78, especially recently because the group has taken on climate as one of their key concerns. So I think there's a marriage now of interest that might well open the door to having him come.
Well, tell me about that. To what extent and in what way has a group of 78 become engaged with climate?
This initiative called Climate Legacy, and I'd invite Tim to talk about it because he's on the steering committee. But this is a new venture for the group of 78. Tim, do you want to say a few words about that?
Sure. The last annual meeting of the group really was focused on climate. It's come up with a very comprehensive statement of some of the policy areas that we think the government should be, and citizens, not just the government. I mean, it's really all levels of government. But one of the initiatives that has emerged is, as Roy said, is called Climate Legacy, and it's really an effort by a number of retired people to reach out to older Canadians to say, you know, it's all very well having Greta Thunberg and young people demonstrating and expressing their concerns, but we're the ones who benefited all this time from a low carbon economy. We can't stand by and not be concerned about the state of the world that we're leaving to our children and grandchildren. So what can older Canadians do? And Climate Legacy's argument is that actually older Canadians have some really unique assets. We have more time. We have money in the form of pensions or investments that we can direct into the new economy, the net zero carbon economy, you might say, and we vote, we speak out. So how are we using those assets? First of all, are we aware of them? And secondly, if we are, what are we doing? And what we've seen is that there are a very large number of local organizations, local groups, informal get-togethers of people who are very concerned about what's happening. They see it. They see it if they're living in rural areas. They see it if they're living in cities. They see it if they read accounts of natural disasters occurring in various parts of the country, including in Canada. And so Climate Legacy is really about organizing this large number of Canadians who have tremendous power, in fact, if they choose to use it, to ensure that the responsibility for addressing the climate crisis is not left to young people alone.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay.
And this has emerged out of a cooperative relationship between the group of 78, which is the host of Climate Legacy, and Climate Legacy, which is a standalone project which does different things, including putting on a series of webinars about how seniors can channel their investments away from fossil fuels into the green economy. Those are all online, by the way, on the Group of 78's website, as well as on the Climate Legacy website.
Well, are there any people involved in the Group of 78 in a substantial way who are themselves professionally engaged with climate issues, climatologists or other people, for example, people concerned with the Arctic and so on? I can see, personally, the thing that keeps me awake at night, really, there are two things. One is I'm concerned about trees, the importance of forests, and where you should plant them and where you shouldn't plant them, as, for example, not in permafrost. Give me a couple of hours to talk about that. But also the methane, in the Arctic Ocean, which I see as probably the most urgent threat to human survival right now. That thing could go, in a bad way. That those methane deposits, clathrates, not good. Well, so we should have, I would think, promote a conversation about at least those two topics.
Meta, just to answer your question briefly about the people who are involved in the process of climate change negotiations. We have one person on our working group on climate change who was former author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So he's part of our working group that sets and plans and discusses the way forward for the Group 78 by planning conferences and webinar presentations. And our speakers who come to our conferences. One of our speakers, for example, is writing a chapter for the IPCC in its next report. And she was a speaker at our September conference on adaptation to climate change.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay.
Meta, could I back up and just give you a bit more context of how we operate currently?
Please.
A couple of things have evolved over the years. We have our annual conferences, of which you've been at a few over the years. Then we've had historically our monthly lunch meetings, and the conferences and the lunch meetings have covered a very wide swath of foreign policy and international affairs issues. And I won't enumerate those, but we touched on almost every dimension of foreign affairs over time. But in recent years, and it really is positioning us to, in a couple of ways, to be able to speak out, so that we call the conferences and the luncheons and the other special events we hold that's the dialogue part of the Group of 78, where we bring experts together with advocates and involved people, and we debate the issues. The other part is advocacy, which is what the original statement was all about, to be able to speak from civil society, from the citizenry, to government about what we think should be the direction of this or that particular issue. But in recent years, we've tried to organize this in a more systematic way. And so we've struck 3 working groups a few years ago. Again, there are broad themes in each case, but they reflect what we're concentrating on, not to the exclusion of other matters, but the particular focus that we're looking at these days. Climate change is one, as has been mentioned. Peace and security is another. And economic and social justice is the third. And so in recent years, we've had these working groups lead the planning and execution of our annual conferences in rotation. So that 3 years ago, for instance, we had a conference on the climate change, where we focused principally on the mitigation side of things, which touched on the points you raised earlier about the Arctic and methane and other contributors to the disaster we're experiencing. And so this year, as Roy just mentioned, we felt that we needed to, when we looked at climate change again, we needed to look at the forgotten side of climate change, and that is how to adapt to the already to the consequences we're already feeling about climate change. And this particularly pertains in the global south, where adaptation is the order of the day, because they are responsible, countries there are responsible for a very small degree of the greenhouse gas emissions, and they need to adjust to the problems that we in the north have created. But our other working groups have looked at social and economic inequality. We've looked at peacekeeping under our peace and security working group, so that out of these, and then again, out of these meetings, be they lunch meetings and particularly the conferences, we generate our policy positions. And these have gone forward to ministers. Whether they're listening or not, we will keep this up, and we try in various ways through social media and particularly in an alliance with other organizations. If our voice isn't heard so clearly, we know that multiple voices speaking from the same storybook, the same songbook can be heard more readily.
Have you done that? Have you linked up
Yes.
with other groups?
Well, I was
which are some of the ones that you've partnered with?
tell you an example of that. This goes back about 3 years, I believe. We're all aware of the issue of the Saudi arms deal, where we're sending these armored cars to Saudi Arabia, and there's been a lot of pushback on that. And we were able to we wrote a statement 2.5, 3 years ago, and shopped that around with various other peace groups, Project Plowshares, and among others, United Nations Association, and Amnesty International, and we ended up with about, I don't know, forgotten, Roy, maybe 17, 18 organizations.
Over a dozen anyway.
You know, who were behind this, and we wrote a letter, and we had it published, and it the government clearly didn't reverse their policy of continuing to ship these things, but it did cause a bit of a furor in the media and in public discourse, and we think it contributed to the pausing of this action, and gave the government an opportunity to rethink and to try to pull back a little bit from this action. So it was a very good action in that it brought voices together, and it had some impact, at least in the policy sphere.
Another example is in the peace area. We've been a member of the Canadian Network for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, the CNANW, which encompasses some dozen or 15 organizations, and we're a participant in this network. So we've signed on to declarations and statements about the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has come to the forefront as a vehicle for nuclear disarmament and those who propose nuclear disarmament.
Actually, that's something that I'm aware of, because when I was going to Ottawa for in the fall, it would generally be a weekend when about 5 of these do-good organizations that I belong to or feel an affinity for all seem to get together about the same weekend. And if you go, you can go from one meeting to another, to another, to another, see the same people pretty much, and yet just have a very full conversation and exposure to issues that I don't think anybody, when they're planning their annual get-together, I don't imagine these groups coordinate, but somehow it all works out to be a very wonderful weekend. So CNANW and Group of 78 and the Pugwash movement, and sometimes the Voice of Women even, have had their annual get-togethers in the same hotel, or even. I used to try to look for, to see whether there were factions within the movement. Let's call this whole thing one big movement that I've just alluded to, these groups, in the sense that, the goals are completely compatible, if not identical. But there are differences of opinion on certain issues. And I think for a while, it seemed to me, whether this is a fair thing to say, I'm not sure, but it seemed to me that some of the people who actually had held government bureaucratic posts would tend to have a more cautious position than some of the people who worked with advocacy and activist groups. Is that a fair statement? Or tell me if there have been controversies at all about policies, what have they been about?
Well, I can certainly name one for you, and that's nuclear power.
Oh, yeah.
Huge differences about nuclear power. A lot of people say, of course, that are against it, and then others are saying we need it for dealing with climate change. And that controversy is emerging more strongly than ever now.
Another issue that we've had in the early days had trouble addressing as the Group of 78, and that was the thorny question of the Middle East. And
Mhm.
in early years, we tended to avoid any in-depth discussion on this matter because there were sensitivities across the spectrum, as there is in society on, and where you come from is often determines your point of view. However, we adjusted to that. We recognized that this is an ongoing, probably it's one of the most complex human issues on Earth in
Absolutely.
a post-Second World War, and it defies any serious solution so far. But we did learn to address it, so that we had one of our conferences some years ago address it, and we were expecting a lot of controversy from within our own membership even, but it didn't happen. It turned out that we were able to have an intelligent and civilized discussion about it, and come up with some conclusions, so that now whether we could have done that in the early days of the group when it was more fragile, it's a question mark, but it was one where we evolved as a group and felt that after some time we could have an in-depth discussion about this and come out and still be talking to each other.
That issue has just exploded in the Science for Peace discussion list lately.
Mhm. I know, and so did when I organized this thing called How to Save the World in a Hurry about 3 years ago. It was at that point under the Science for Peace mantle, but it was there was a big explosion in terms of nuclear power issue. The question of whether or not nuclear power was a good thing was extremely heated, and I wonder whether the Group of 78 has managed to have as civil a discourse on that topic as you did on the Middle East. You can take both of those topics. Good for you.
I don't believe we have, but there is one area of contention that has emerged lately, and that relates to Venezuela. There's part of the peace and international affairs community was appalled at the prospect of armed intervention, led by the United States into Venezuela to try and straighten out the mess that was going on there. And another part of the community was appalled by the mess that was there, but not willing to take that step, and very defensive about the regime in Venezuela. So that's been another area of debate.
That's true, and in fact, I think I'd be very interested in a poll. I haven't seen it in terms of the peace movement, how people, what the distribution of opinion is. But I would think there's probably more support for the government in Venezuela now than there is for this Guaido outfit. That's my guess, and I'm on the other side. I'm with Guaido, if anything, but I don't know. What would your impression be? What do you think the distribution? If we did a survey, which may not be a good idea at all, what do you think the people would line up in terms of on nuclear, on the Middle East, and let's say on Venezuela?
Well, it always depends on the question that you ask, right? That's why surveys are such slippery slopes. So I think you'd find a divided community on each of those issues. And I think the response is to discuss them in a civil way, and trying to come to some kind of common understanding. That would be my approach.
Mm-hmm. There's another topic that I run into, but not as often. It's not as well formulated. And that is the question of whether or not solutions to all of our global problems will, and especially population, will require a cutback in our standard of living, and whether the economy needs to, in a way, contract, or at least move to a deliberate no growth kind of economy. And I find this rarely expressed as such, but it really underlies a lot of things. And I think, Peter, you're pretty much involved with this Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, right? I think the Club of Rome came out of primarily a group of people wanting to promote the idea that we have to reduce consumption and especially be careful about the raw materials and so on, and that will mean that there'll have to be a no-growth economy. I don't think, as far as I know, the Group of 78 has never taken a position on any of these things officially, but where to give me a sense of where you think public opinion is within the organization.
Well, I'm delighted you brought this up because our next annual conference in September of 2022 is going to be precisely on this issue of where the economy and where economic thinking goes in a post-pandemic world. And a lot of the conversation is about economic growth. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? But you dig a little deeper and you get into issues of it's not the quantity of economic growth that matters, it's the quality of economic growth. There's something a little too facile and simplistic about just measuring how much you consume and turning that into a good thing called GDP or GNI or whatever. I think one has to burrow a little deeper to sort of unpackage what we consider to be socially productive and socially useful and what we consider to be socially dangerous. And there's a number of thinkers like Kate Rayworth from the UK who addresses these issues, and hopefully she can be one of our keynote speakers.
Is she the donut lady?
She's the donut lady. That's precisely it.
Okay.
So we're working. In fact, just in next week we're having a working group meeting to discuss starting to define the topic and the keynote speakers for our conference next year
Okay.
on these kinds of issues.
Okay, I want to follow that because I've tried to organize some conversations in my talk shows about that. And I did get one man, I can't think of his name at the moment, but he co-authored a book with Noam Chomsky, which really argues that growth is essential. And I guess his position is fairly similar to yours. But I think, the radically anti-growth position basically says you just plain can't have any kind of growth without greater use of natural resources that we can't afford to do, and that there's a word for decoupling the two things, the use of resources and the growth of I can't think what's the word for that. There's one term that I can't think of, but the question is that realistically possible? Can a country, any country, continue to grow while at the same time not using more natural resources?
Well, you also have to sort of look at the global distribution of this issue. There are some areas of the world that are so poor that growth is very essential to their future. And there's other areas of the world, the rich countries, where growth is superfluous. And if you look at the relationship between growth or GDP or GNI on the one hand and happiness indexes on the other hand, it turns out that the richer you become, you don't become any happier. But
after a certain point.
After a certain point, yeah.
But unfortunately, it's a pretty high point.
Well, no, that depends on your point of view.
It's not very high, actually.
No?
The calculations I've seen are around $70,000 or $75,000 a year of income is about the maximum that really translates into increases in human happiness and well-being. So the challenge for us is to decouple the notion of standard of living from level of consumption. The circular economy, for example, which is getting increasing attention, is all about how do we reuse? How do we create things which allow us to reuse as much as possible the inputs, so that you're not constantly drawing from nature more natural resources. You're making sure that what you do use, you use and reuse and reuse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Instead of
Absolutely
generating
key.
more and more waste, most of it plastic.
Now we're talking, for example, about regenerative agriculture. So rather than the exploitative model we've had of, stick more and more inputs into the ground, produce an absolute maximum of mostly monocultures, now people are saying, no, that's not how nature works. Regenerative agriculture is rethinking the whole thing. And in fact, it's learning to a certain extent from indigenous traditions.
Mhm.
How do we value nature and what it provides us, as opposed to seeing it only as a resource to be exploited? So there's a lot of work being done. It's for me, it's more a matter of time. Do we have the time to work through all of this before the effects of catastrophic change end up overwhelming us?
Absolutely.
These issues are very much on the front burner, and they were the subject of debate at the UN's food summit over the summer. And they promised to become more and more intense. But one of the interesting statistics I have come across, that came up at our annual conference, is that the world currently produces 3 times as much food as it consumes. There's colossal amounts of food wasted along the way. So
3 times. That is really extraordinary. I did see, I've done several shows on this, and I have talked to Ralph Martin, who's a plant professor of agriculture at Guelph, said something like in Canada, it's about between 40 and 50% of our food is wasted. And a lot of it is in the household. We just throw away food that is perfectly good.
And it's all part of the GDP, see? So the higher your GDP, the better off you are. But in fact, that's not the case.
Right, of course.
And let's just look at the concentration of wealth. The growth that's happened in the last 40, 50 years has been largely absorbed by a few, a small number, relatively small number of major corporations and individuals. If you look at the North American the average wage earner from, say, the mid-1970s till now, if you discount for or take into consideration inflation and all of that, he or she is earning about the same amount of money to meet their basic needs. Whereas we say that the GDP has grown, almost exponentially since then. Well, where is all that wealth gone? It's a maldistribution. And so there's plenty to go. What that says is there's plenty to go around. And that's what my colleagues have been talking about, regardless of what field it's in. And we have to learn to redistribute that before we put the god of unending growth before us, and so it's not it's a matter for the individual, for ordinary people to be able to grow in their own context, not necessarily for the total growth of the world economy measured or badly measured in terms of GNP.
Well, now, if Roy's already got a plan for the next meeting, which I'm delighted to hear, that you're going to talk about whether or not the growth can continue, but then that would bring up at least 2 different successive conferences that I can think of. One would be taxation, taxing wealth, which, by the way, it looks like it's moving in that direction. Looks like even the U.S. is going to put a tax on billionaires, et cetera. So that may actually be happening, changes in taxation. But there are also things about consumption and that sort of thing, how to stop waste, and another topic would be the power of corporations, because clearly I just had another conversation with somebody who attributes all of the world's problems to the excessive power of corporations. So you got 3 or 4 new topics there that all connect with each other. I don't think you can do them in one show. Do you, Roy?
No, but there'll be future conferences, so they won't go to waste, promise.
Okay. So you're planning this thing. When will this one be? In the next fall?
They're always in late September. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully by then we'll have an in-person conference, but we'll leave open the option of bringing people in by Zoom if they can't come to the meeting.
Well, keep doing that even for your luncheon things, because I'd love to come to some of your luncheon things, which I haven't been doing
I
didn't know you were doing them on Zoom.
Well, perhaps we can jump in and say that we had to repivot or pivot rather very quickly with COVID. And in some ways it's been a boom because we've been able to have more meetings instead of people just, a few people in Ottawa trudging down to a restaurant in midwinter to break bread and have a chat. We've been able to bring people in from right across the country. In fact, globally, and with our speakers as well, not just people who are in Ottawa or passing through Ottawa, but people who we've reached out really around the world for our speakers. And this has enriched our discussions considerably. And so they're all online, all easily available. One can make a small donation to help us defray some of these costs, but otherwise they are free. And so they're easily available to everybody. And we post them on our website afterwards, as you do with this program, so that they're accessible afterwards as well. And we figure that's an ongoing contribution to public discourse on this wide range of issues.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. I didn't even know about it, Richard. I'm delighted to hear it. I had a chat yesterday with Doug Roach, who is generally very hostile to these Zoom meetings. He just hates Zoom because he says he likes to hug people. I never saw him hug anybody. He never hugged me, but at any rate, he says he misses hugging people. Well, okay, I miss hugging people too, but I really have been having a ball with Zoom. I would have to say that the pandemic has just been a joy to me in terms of my personal life, because I've had the richest social life of my whole career, being able to talk with folks like you that I probably wouldn't have had this conversation with otherwise. And the same with people around the world. Every day of the week, I get a different conversation. So I think Zoom has done wonders for us. And that whole thing about one of the conversations is about globalization. Of course, most of the time you talk about globalization, you just mean the economy. But I think that the cultural connectivity that's increased by this kind of Zooming that we're now able to do is a terrific asset. So keep it up. Yeah.
KCOR has moved from one luncheon meeting a month to at least one Zoom a week.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. What else do we want to say before we sign off? Who's got a future projection you want to direct us toward?
Well, Meta, I was just going to reinforce our messages that came out of the conference in September. So on our website, there are key messages and recommendations to our conference on adaptation, building resilience against the climate emergency. So that is available on our website if people want to have a quick look at what we came up with in terms of conclusions and recommendations.
Okay, I have to do more to promote things like, allied webinars and so on, such as the one you've been doing. We should share publicity or, help promote each other, because I think all of these conversations are things that my audience would like to hear more about too. So, well, I think this has been great. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Madam. Take care, everyone.
We'll actually see each other in the flesh one of these days, but it's just great having a Zoom conversation.
Will you give us a hug?
Take care. Bye now.
Bye-bye.